The morning sun cast long shadows across the Modoc reservation as 18-year-old Sarah Walking Bear stood at her bedroom window, watching the dust settle on the dirt road where the government car had disappeared just hours before. Her grandmother's words still echoed in her mind like a broken record player, stuck on the same haunting melody. "You have been chosen, child. The Martinez family has made their decision." Sarah's hands trembled as she touched the simple wooden cross hanging around her neck, a gift from her grandmother before the old woman had passed away 3 months ago. The cross felt heavier today, weighted with the burden of tradition and expectation that now rested squarely on her young shoulders. She had always known this day would come, but knowing and experiencing were two entirely different beasts. The arrangement had been made when she was just a baby, sealed with handshakes and promises between families who believed in the old ways. Miguel Martinez, now 35 and recently widowed, needed a wife to help raise his 2 young children and manage his growing cattle ranch that bordered the reservation. Sarah's family needed the financial security and protection that such a union would provide. It was practical, logical, and completely terrifying to a girl who had never been kissed. Her reflection in the mirror showed a young woman with long black hair braided down her back, dark eyes that held wisdom beyond her years, and skin that had been kissed by countless summers under the California sun. She wore a simple blue dress that her aunt had sewn for the occasion, modest and proper, exactly what was expected of a good Modoc girl about to become a wife. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her heart race. Her Aunt Maria appeared in the doorway, carrying a small leather suitcase that had belonged to Sarah's mother. "It's time, mija," Maria said softly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "The Martinez family is expecting you before sunset." Sarah nodded, though every fiber of her being wanted to run. She had heard stories about Miguel Martinez from the other women on the reservation. He was a good man, they said, hard-working and fair in his business dealings with the tribal council. His first wife had died in childbirth 2 years ago, leaving him with a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son who barely remembered their mother. But there were other stories, too, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when Sarah entered a room. Something about Miguel's past, about why he had left his hometown in Mexico so suddenly 20 years ago. Something about a scandal that had followed him north across the border like a shadow he couldn't shake. As Sarah packed her few belongings into the worn suitcase, she thought about her grandmother's final words to her. The old woman had been delirious with fever, speaking in a mixture of Modoc and Spanish that Sarah barely understood. But one phrase had been crystal clear: "Beware the man who keeps secrets from God." At the time, Sarah had assumed her grandmother was talking about someone from her past, perhaps a memory from her own youth. Now, as she prepared to leave the only home she had ever known to marry a man she had met only twice, those words took on a different meaning, entirely. The drive to the Martinez ranch took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads that carved through pine forests and open meadows where cattle grazed peacefully in the afternoon heat. Sarah's uncle drove in silence, occasionally glancing at her in the rearview mirror with an expression that mixed pride and concern in equal measure. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Sarah was surprised by its size and obvious prosperity. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure, with a red tile roof and a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Flowering gardens bordered the walkways, and the sound of children's laughter drifted from somewhere behind the house. Miguel Martinez stepped out onto the veranda as their truck pulled into the circular driveway. He was taller than Sarah remembered, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and his brown eyes held a kindness that helped ease some of Sarah's nervousness. But there was something else in those eyes, too, something that reminded Sarah of a wounded animal that had learned to be cautious around humans. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, done too much, or perhaps hidden too much from the world around him. As Sarah stepped out of the truck and smoothed down her dress, she caught sight of Miguel's children peeking around the corner of the house. The little girl had her father's dark eyes and a mass of curly hair that had escaped from its braids. The boy was smaller, shyer, hiding mostly behind his sister while stealing curious glances at the stranger who was about to become their new mother. Miguel walked down the steps to greet them, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached Sarah, he stopped just close enough to be polite but far enough away to be respectful. "Welcome to your new home, Sarah," he said in accented English, his voice warm but formal. "I hope you will find happiness here." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. As her uncle unloaded her suitcase and said his goodbyes, she found herself truly alone with her new family for the first time. The weight of her grandmother's cross seemed to grow heavier around her neck, and somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the old woman's voice warning her once again about men who kept secrets from God. The first week at the Martinez Ranch passed like a strange dream, where Sarah felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold before her eyes. Miguel had given her the master bedroom while he moved his belongings to a smaller room down the hall, a gesture of respect that surprised her, but also highlighted the awkward nature of their arrangement. They were married in name only, strangers sharing a house and the responsibility of raising two children who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Elena, the 6-year-old, was bold and talkative, constantly chattering in rapid-fire Spanish that Sarah struggled to follow. The little girl seemed fascinated by Sarah's long braids and would often reach out to touch them when she thought no one was looking. Roberto, the 4-year-old, was his sister's opposite, quiet, watchful, and prone to hiding behind furniture when adults entered the room. Sarah threw herself into the role of caretaker with the same determination that had helped her excel in school. She learned to cook Miguel's favorite meals by watching the elderly housekeeper Rosa, who came twice a week to help with the heavy cleaning. She mended clothes, tended the vegetable garden, and slowly began to win over the children with stories her grandmother had told her about the old days when spirits walked freely among the Modoc people. But it was the nights that proved most challenging. After the children were asleep and the dishes were washed and put away, an uncomfortable silence would settle over the house like a heavy blanket. Miguel would retreat to his study to work on ranch business, while Sarah would sit on the front porch, listening to the sounds of the night, and wondering if she would ever truly belong in this place. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she first noticed the locked cabinet in Miguel's study. She had gone to ask him about Elena's schooling when she saw him quickly closing what looked like a wooden box and sliding it into the cabinet before turning the key. When he noticed her standing in the doorway, his face flushed red and he stammered an excuse about important papers that needed to be kept safe. The incident might have been forgotten if not for what happened the following Sunday after church. Father Martinez, an elderly priest who shared Miguel's surname but claimed no relation, had invited the family for dinner at the rectory. During the meal, the conversation turned to Miguel's early days in California, and Sarah noticed how quickly her husband changed the subject whenever the priest asked about his life before arriving at the ranch. Miguel has always been a private man, Father Martinez said later as he walked Sarah through his garden, while Miguel helped the children catch fireflies in mason jars. But privacy and secrecy are different things, child. One protects the innocent while the other often protects the guilty. The priest's words struck Sarah like a physical blow, reminding her so strongly of her grandmother's warning that she had to grip the garden fence to steady herself. Father Martinez noticed her distress and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Has he been good to you? Treated you with respect?" Sarah nodded quickly because that much was true. Miguel had been nothing but kind and considerate, never pushing for intimacy or making her feel uncomfortable in any way. But kindness and honesty were also different things, and she was beginning to understand that her husband was carrying secrets that went far deeper than simple privacy. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sarah found herself drawn to Miguel's study like a moth to flame. The house was completely silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of cattle moving restlessly in the fields. The study door was ajar, and moonlight streaming through the windows illuminated the locked cabinet that had captured her attention days earlier. She knew she shouldn't, knew that whatever Miguel was hiding was none of her business until he chose to make it so. But her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in the darkness, urging her forward with words about the importance of truth and the danger of building a life on foundations of sand. The cabinet was old and well made, but the lock was simple. Sarah's uncle had taught her to pick locks when she was 12, a skill that had come in handy during her rebellious teenage years when she needed to retrieve confiscated books from the school principal's office. Her hands shook as she worked the thin piece of wire she had taken from the kitchen, and when the lock finally clicked open, she had to take several deep breaths before she could bring herself to open the door. Inside the cabinet was the wooden box she had seen Miguel hide, along with several folders filled with official-looking documents. The box was made of dark wood carved with intricate patterns that looked Mexican in origin. When she lifted the lid, the scent of old leather and dried flowers filled her nostrils. The box contained photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same woman at different ages. She was beautiful in the way that took Sarah's breath away. Delicate features, enormous dark eyes, and a smile that seemed to light up every picture. In some photos she was alone. In others she was with Miguel. And in the most recent ones she was holding babies that Sarah recognized as Elena and Roberto. But it was the newspaper clipping at the bottom of the box that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water in her veins. The headline was in Spanish, but the date was clear. Just 3 years ago, not 2 as Miguel had told everyone. The accompanying photograph showed the same beautiful woman, but this time the caption underneath identified her as Carmen Valdez Martinez, age 28, found dead in her home in Guadalajara under suspicious circumstances. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to make sense of the Spanish text. Her grandmother had taught her some of the language, but the formal newspaper style was difficult to follow. What she could understand, however, was enough to turn her stomach and make her question everything she thought she knew about the man sleeping down the hall. The article mentioned an investigation, questions about the husband's whereabouts, and a sudden departure from the country before authorities could conduct a thorough interview. It mentioned a substantial life insurance policy and debts that had mysteriously disappeared after Carmen's death. As Sarah carefully replaced everything in the box and relocked the cabinet, her mind raced with possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. Had Miguel killed his first wife? Was that why he had fled Mexico and ended up on a remote ranch in California? And if so, what did that mean for her own safety and the safety of his children? The walk back to her bedroom felt like the longest journey of her life. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like thunder in her ears, and she was certain that Miguel would appear at any moment to demand an explanation for her late-night wandering. But the house remained silent, and she made it to her room without being discovered. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Sarah's hand instinctively went to her grandmother's cross. The old woman's warning about men who kept secrets from God had taken on a terrible new meaning, and Sarah realized that she was trapped in a situation far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The discovery of the newspaper clipping changed everything for Sarah, though she struggled to maintain the appearance of normalcy as days turned into weeks. Every interaction with Miguel became a careful dance of watching and being watched, of searching for signs of danger while trying not to reveal her own growing suspicions. She found herself studying his hands as he helped Elena with her homework, wondering if those same gentle fingers had wrapped around his first wife's throat. She watched the way he moved through the house at night, silent as a predator, and wondered if Carmen had heard those same footsteps in her final moments. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it brought nightmares filled with images of beautiful women with enormous dark eyes pleading for help, while shadowy figures advanced through moonlit rooms. Sarah would wake gasping, her nightgown soaked with sweat, only to realize that the house around her was perfectly quiet, and Miguel's soft snoring could be heard through the thin walls. The children, innocent of the dark thoughts consuming their new stepmother, continued their gradual acceptance of Sarah's presence in their lives. Elena had begun calling her Mama Sarah, and would climb onto her lap during evening story time, her small body warm and trusting against Sarah's chest. Roberto remained shy but had started leaving small gifts on Sarah's pillow, smooth stones from the creek, wildflowers picked during his adventures around the ranch, a drawing of what might have been the family standing in front of their house. These moments of genuine affection made Sarah's situation even more complicated. If Miguel was truly dangerous, what about the children? Were they safe with their father? Or had they simply been too young to understand what had happened to their real mother? The thought of Elena and Roberto being in danger made Sarah's chest tight with panic. But she had no idea who she could turn to for help or advice. Father Martinez visited the ranch again 2 weeks after their dinner at the rectory, ostensibly to check on the family's spiritual well-being, but clearly concerned about Sarah's pale complexion and the dark circles under her eyes. Miguel was working in the far pastures that day, giving Sarah the opportunity to speak privately with the priest while the children played in the garden. "You look troubled, child," Father Martinez said gently as they sat together on the front porch, watching Elena teach Roberto how to braid grass into small dolls. Marriage to a stranger is never easy, but you seem to carry a heavier burden than most new brides. Sarah wanted desperately to tell him everything, about the locked cabinet, the newspaper clipping, her growing fears about Miguel's past and her own safety, but something held her back. Perhaps the knowledge that accusations without proof could destroy an innocent man's life, or perhaps simple fear of what Miguel might do if he discovered her suspicions. Instead, she asked carefully, "Father, what do you know about Miguel's first wife, the children's mother?" The priest was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he seemed to choose his words carefully. Carmen was a beautiful woman, both inside and out. Her death was a great tragedy, especially for the little ones. They were so young when it happened. "Miguel doesn't like to talk about her," Sarah said, testing the waters. "I understand that grief affects people differently, but sometimes I wonder if there's more to the story." Father Martinez turned to look at her directly, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence and concern. "What kind of more, child?" Before Sarah could answer, the sound of Miguel's truck approaching the house made both of them fall silent. The priest gathered his things and prepared to leave, but as he walked past Sarah's chair, he paused and spoke quietly so only she could hear. "There are things about Miguel's past that trouble me as well, child. If you ever need sanctuary, the church doors are always open to you." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. If Father Martinez, who had known Miguel for years, was also harboring suspicions about the man's past, then perhaps her fears were not the product of an overactive imagination after all. That night, Sarah made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation that her grandmother had taught her. She needed more information, and the only way to get it was to take greater risks. After Miguel had retired to his room and the children were sound asleep, she returned to the study with a small flashlight and a determination born of desperation. This time, she focused on the folders in the cabinet rather than the wooden box. Most contained boring ranch business, bills of sale for cattle, correspondence with feed suppliers, tax documents that showed Miguel's property was worth far more than she had realized. But buried beneath the legitimate paperwork was a manila envelope that contained documents in both Spanish and English. The English documents were translations of Mexican legal papers, and as Sarah read through them by flashlight, a picture began to emerge that was even more disturbing than she had imagined. Miguel had not simply fled Mexico after his wife's death. He had been formally accused of her murder by Carmen's family. The charges had been dropped when key witnesses mysteriously changed their stories, and Miguel had left the country before the case could be reopened. But the most chilling document was a letter from a private investigator in Guadalajara, dated just 6 months ago. The investigator reported that Carmen's brother had been asking questions about Miguel's whereabouts and had hired someone to track him down. The letter warned that the brother was convinced of Miguel's guilt and was planning to take matters into his own hands if the Mexican authorities would not act. Sarah's hands shook as she read the final paragraph of the letter. The investigator strongly advised Miguel to consider relocating again, perhaps to somewhere even more remote than the California ranch. He warned that Carmen's family would not give up their search for justice, and that Miguel's new marriage to an American woman might provide additional legal protections but would not necessarily keep him safe from personal retribution. As Sarah carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, her mind raced with the implications of what she had discovered. Not only was Miguel potentially a murderer, but he was also a man living in fear of his past catching up with him. And by marrying her, he had potentially put her directly in the path of that danger. The sound of footsteps in the hallway froze Sarah's blood in her veins. She quickly closed the cabinet and turned off the flashlight, pressing herself against the wall in the darkness as the footsteps approached the study. The door creaked open and Miguel's silhouette appeared in the doorway, backlit by the moonlight streaming through the hall window. "Sarah?" he called softly. "Are you in here?" Sarah held her breath, praying that the shadows would hide her presence. Miguel stepped into the room and moved toward his desk, apparently looking for something. In the dim light, she could see that he was fully dressed despite the late hour, and when he turned toward the cabinet, Sarah noticed that he was carrying what looked like a small suitcase. Miguel opened the cabinet and quickly removed the wooden box and several of the folders, stuffing them into the suitcase with practiced efficiency. He was leaving, Sarah realized with a mixture of relief and terror. But what about the children? What about her? As if summoned by her thoughts, Miguel suddenly turned in her direction, and Sarah knew with awful certainty that he could see her hiding in the shadows. Their eyes met across the dark room, and in that moment Sarah understood that her life had just taken a turn from which there might be no return. The silence that stretched between Sarah and Miguel in the darkened study felt like an eternity, though it could have lasted only seconds. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as Miguel slowly set down the suitcase and took a step toward her hiding place. In the pale moonlight filtering through the windows, his face was a mask of shadows that made it impossible to read his expression or intentions. "How long have you been watching me?" Miguel asked quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth she had grown accustomed to during their brief marriage. This was a different man entirely, one whose careful control had finally slipped to reveal something harder and more dangerous underneath. Sarah pressed herself further against the wall, her mouth too dry to form words. Miguel took another step closer, and she could smell his cologne mixed with the scent of night air, as if he had been outside preparing for a journey she was never meant to know about. "Answer me, Sarah." The command in his voice made her flinch, and she realized that her silence was only making things worse. Whatever happened next, she needed to be smart about it. Needed to find a way to protect herself and the children who were sleeping innocently down the hall. "I couldn't sleep," she managed to whisper, the lie feeling clumsy on her tongue. "I heard noises and came to check." Miguel's laugh was short and bitter. "Do you take me for a fool? You've been different for weeks now, watching me like a frightened rabbit watches a hawk. What did you find in my things?" The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. Part of her wanted to continue the pretense of innocence, but another part recognized that Miguel was far too intelligent to be fooled by amateur deception. If she was going to survive this confrontation, she needed to be honest about what she knew while being careful about how she revealed it. "I found the newspaper," she said simply, lifting her chin despite her fear, "the one about Carmen's death." Miguel's shoulders sagged slightly as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally become too heavy to bear. He moved to his desk chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. "I was wondering when this moment would come," he said quietly, "when someone would look deep enough to find the truth about who I really am." Sarah remained frozen against the wall, unsure whether his apparent resignation was genuine or simply another mask to hide his true intentions. "Did you kill her?" The question escaped before she could stop it, hanging in the air between them like a physical presence. Miguel was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he had heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Not with my hands. But yes, I killed her just the same." The admission hit Sarah like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting it. Hearing the words spoken aloud made the danger of her situation terrifyingly real. She was alone in a house with a confessed murderer, miles from the nearest neighbor, with 2 sleeping children who had no idea their father was capable of such violence. "Carmen was sick," Miguel continued, his gaze fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. "Depression, the doctors called it, though they didn't understand it the way we do now. After Roberto was born, she couldn't stop crying, couldn't get out of bed some days. I thought it would pass, thought she just needed time to adjust to having 2 children." Sarah found herself listening despite her terror, drawn into a story that was clearly more complicated than the newspaper article had suggested. "I was building the business, working 18-hour days to make enough money to give us a good life. I left her alone too much, expected her to manage everything while I chased dreams of success. When she begged me to stay home to help her with the children, I told her she was being selfish." Miguel's hands clenched into fists on the desk surface, and Sarah tensed, ready to run if he made any sudden movements. The night she died, Carmen called me at the office. She was crying, said she couldn't take it anymore, that she felt like she was drowning and no one could see her struggling. I was in the middle of an important meeting with investors, and I told her we would talk when I got home. I told her to stop being dramatic and take care of the children. The raw pain in Miguel's voice was so genuine that Sarah found herself feeling sympathy for him despite everything she knew about his past. But sympathy and safety were 2 different things, and she remained pressed against the wall, calculating her chances of reaching the door before he could stop her. When I came home 3 hours later, I found her in the bathroom. She had taken pills, Left a note saying she was sorry but couldn't fight anymore. The note blamed me for not listening, for not seeing how much pain she was in. She was right, Sarah. I killed her with my selfishness and neglect as surely as if I had forced those pills down her throat. Sarah's mind reeled as she processed this new version of events. But the newspaper said it was suspicious that there was an investigation. Miguel's bitter laugh filled the room again. Carmen's family never accepted that she would take her own life. In their minds, their perfect daughter could never be so unhappy that she would abandon her children. They needed someone to blame, and I was the obvious target. The witnesses who changed their stories? I paid them, Miguel admitted without shame. The housekeeper who found Carmen's body, the neighbor who heard us arguing the night before, even the pharmacist who sold her the pills. I paid them all to tell a different version of the truth because I was terrified of losing Elena and Roberto. Carmen's family wanted to take the children back to Mexico, claimed I was an unfit father. If the investigation had continued, if the suicide note had become public, they might have succeeded. Sarah felt her worldview shifting as she tried to reconcile this new information with the assumptions she had made based on incomplete evidence. Miguel was not a cold-blooded killer, but he was a man who had let his wife spiral into despair and then covered up the circumstances of her death to protect himself and his children. "Why did you leave Mexico?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Carmen's brother Eduardo refused to let it go. He hired private investigators, threatened anyone who had changed their testimony, made it clear that he would never stop hunting for what he called justice. I realized that staying would only put Elena and Roberto in danger. Caught between their father and their uncle's obsession with revenge, Miguel stood up from the chair, and Sarah instinctively backed toward the door. But instead of approaching her, he moved to the window and stared out at the moonlit landscape. Eduardo found me 6 months ago. Sent word through intermediaries that he was coming to California, that he would finish what the Mexican authorities had started. That's why I was packing tonight. Sarah, I received another message yesterday saying he's less than a week away. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Sarah. Miguel's nervousness over the past few weeks, his sudden interest in updating his will and life insurance policies, his insistence that she learn how to access the ranch's bank accounts. He had been preparing for the possibility that he might not survive Eduardo's arrival. What about the children? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Miguel turned from the window to face her, and in the moonlight she could see tears glistening on his cheeks. They'll be your responsibility now, Sarah. That's why I married you, why I needed someone I could trust to be their mother if something happens to me. The ranch, the money, everything I've built here, it all belongs to you and them if I don't come back. The full scope of Miguel's deception hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had not been chosen as a wife, but as a guardian. Not for love or even companionship, but as insurance against an uncertain future. The arrangement her family had celebrated as a blessing was actually a trap, designed to ensure that Miguel's children would be cared for after he paid the price for his past mistakes. "You used me," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with betrayal and anger. "You married me under false pretenses, brought me into your house to clean up the mess you made of your life." Miguel nodded slowly, making no attempt to defend his actions. "Yes, and I'm sorrier for that than you'll ever know. But Sarah, those children upstairs are innocent. Whatever you think of me, whatever I deserve for what I've done, Elena and Roberto need someone to protect them from the storm that's coming." As if summoned by the mention of their names, the sound of crying drifted down the hallway from the children's rooms. Roberto was having one of his nightmares again, calling out for his mama in a voice that broke Sarah's heart despite everything she had just learned. Miguel started toward the door, but Sarah stepped into his path. "No," she said firmly. "I'll go to him. You finish your packing and get out of here before those children wake up and see their father running away like a coward." The words were harsh, but Miguel accepted them without argument. As Sarah walked down the hallway toward Roberto's cries, she realized that her life had just taken another dramatic turn. She was no longer just an unwilling bride or a potential victim. She was about to become the sole protector of 2 children whose father was disappearing into the night, leaving behind only secrets, danger, and a legacy of love tainted by guilt and fear. Sarah spent the remainder of that terrible night holding Roberto while he cried for his father, soothing him back to sleep with lullabies her grandmother had sung to her during her own childhood nightmares. By the time dawn broke over the mountains, Miguel was gone, leaving behind only a brief note on the kitchen table and the weight of responsibility that now rested entirely on Sarah's 18-year-old shoulders. The note was written in Miguel's careful handwriting, every word chosen with the precision of a man who knew it might be his final communication with the children he loved. He explained that he had to go away for a while to take care of important business, that Sarah was now in charge of everything, and that Elena and Roberto should mind her as they would their own father. He signed it simply Papa, and left it propped against the coffee pot where she would be sure to find it. Sarah read the note 3 times before the reality of her situation truly sank in. She was now the sole guardian of 2 children who barely knew her, the owner of a cattle ranch she had no idea how to operate, and potentially the target of a vengeful man who believed Miguel had murdered his sister. The irony was not lost on her that in trying to escape an arranged marriage, she had somehow ended up with even greater responsibilities than she had originally bargained for. Elena woke first, padding into the kitchen in her nightgown with her dark hair tangled from sleep. She looked around the empty room with the instinctive awareness that children have when something important has changed in their world. "Where's Papa?" she asked, climbing onto the chair beside Sarah and reaching for the note before Sarah could stop her. Sarah watched Elena's face as the little girl sounded out the words, her reading skills advanced for her age but still requiring concentration for the longer sentences. When Elena finished, she looked up at Sarah with eyes that were far too old and wise for a 6-year-old. "Papa's gone again, isn't he?" Elena said matter-of-factly, "like when Mama went away." The simple statement broke Sarah's heart and made her realize that these children had already experienced more loss and abandonment than most adults ever would. Elena's calm acceptance of her father's departure suggested this was not the first time Miguel had disappeared without warning. And Sarah wondered how many other secrets and half-truths had shaped these young lives. Roberto appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes and asking for breakfast in the mixture of Spanish and English that he used when he was tired or upset. Sarah gathered him onto her lap, breathing in the little boy scent of his hair while Elena helped prepare cereal and fruit for their morning meal. The normalcy of breakfast was surreal given the circumstances, but Sarah found herself grateful for the routine. Elena chattered about her plans for the day. Roberto spilled milk on his shirt and needed to be changed, and for a few precious minutes it was possible to pretend that they were just a regular family, starting another ordinary day. But reality intruded when Rosa, the housekeeper, arrived for her regular Tuesday shift and immediately noticed Miguel's absence. Rosa had worked for the family since before Elena was born, and her sharp eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the kitchen and noted the subtle signs that something was amiss. "Where is Señor Miguel?" Rosa asked in her heavily accented English, her dark eyes boring into Sarah's face as if she could extract the truth through sheer force of will. Sarah had practiced her answer during the early morning hours, knowing that she would need to provide explanations that would satisfy the various people in their lives without revealing the full truth about Miguel's past or the danger they might all be facing. "He had to go away on business," Sarah said as casually as she could manage. "Important ranch matters that couldn't wait. He'll be gone for several weeks, maybe longer." Rosa's expression made it clear that she didn't believe a word of the explanation, but she had worked for Miguel long enough to understand that there were aspects of his life that were not discussed openly. She nodded slowly and began her cleaning routine, though Sarah noticed that she paid particular attention to Miguel's study and bedroom, as if looking for clues about his sudden departure. The first real test of Sarah's new authority came that afternoon, when Tom Bradley, Miguel's ranch foreman, stopped by the house to discuss the upcoming cattle sale that was scheduled for the following month. Tom was a weathered man in his 50s who had been working the ranch since Miguel first bought the property, and his skeptical expression made it clear that he had serious doubts about taking orders from an 18-year-old girl with no ranching experience. "Miguel didn't mention anything about leaving when I talked to him last week," Tom said bluntly as they sat on the front porch while the children played in the yard. "This is a bad time to be away from the ranch, with the sale coming up and the winter preparations that need to be finished." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as Tom's doubt pressed against her like a physical weight. She had spent the morning going through Miguel's desk, trying to understand the ranch's operations and financial situation, but the complexity of managing hundreds of cattle, seasonal workers, and complex market timing was overwhelming. for someone who had grown up on a small reservation, where the biggest livestock concerns involved a handful of chickens and goats. Miguel left detailed instructions. Sarah lied smoothly, gesturing toward a folder she had assembled from various papers she'd found in the study. He's confident that you and I can handle things until he returns. Tom's skeptical snort made it clear what he thought of that arrangement. No disrespect, ma'am, but running a cattle operation isn't something you learn from reading papers. Miguel's built something important here, and one wrong decision during selling season could cost thousands of dollars. The challenge in Tom's voice triggered something stubborn in Sarah's nature, the same determination that had helped her excel in school despite the low expectations others had for a reservation girl. She stood up from her chair and fixed Tom with the steady gaze her grandmother had taught her to use when facing down bullies and doubters. "Then I guess you'd better teach me quickly," she said firmly, "because like it or not, I'm what you've got until Miguel comes back. We can work together to keep this ranch profitable, or you can find yourself looking for a new job. Your choice." Tom stared at her for a long moment, clearly reevaluating his initial impression of the young woman Miguel had married. Finally, a grudging smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, I'll be damned. You've got some steel in you after all. All right, Mrs. Martinez, let's see what you're made of." The next few days passed in a blur of intensive education as Tom introduced Sarah to every aspect of ranch operations. She learned to read cattle market reports, understand feed calculations, and recognize the signs of illness or injury in the herd. Her hands, soft from her sheltered life on the reservation, quickly developed calluses from handling equipment and working, alongside the ranch hands who initially viewed her with skepticism but gradually began to respect her willingness to get dirty and learned. Elena and Roberto adapted to their father's absence with the resilience that children often display in difficult circumstances. Elena took on the role of little mother, helping Roberto with his meals and bedtime routine while also serving as Sarah's translator when the boy reverted to Spanish during moments of stress or excitement. Roberto continued to have occasional nightmares, but they became less frequent as the days passed, and Sarah's presence provided a new sense of stability in his young life. It was during the second week after Miguel's departure that Sarah first noticed the stranger watching the ranch. She was coming back from checking on the cattle in the north pasture when she saw a dark sedan parked on the hill overlooking their property. Too far away to make out details, but close enough to be obviously observing their activities. The car appeared again the next day, this time parked along the main road that led to town. Sarah mentioned it to Tom, who immediately became alert and serious in a way that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Could be nothing," Tom said, but his weathered hands were already reaching for the rifle he kept in his truck. Could be cattle rustlers scouting the herd, or could be something else entirely. Sarah knew what he meant by something else. Miguel's departure had been motivated by the threat of Eduardo seeking revenge for his sister's death, and the timing of these mysterious surveillance visits was too coincidental to ignore. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the dark landscape and wondering if hostile eyes were watching her from the shadows. She had installed new locks on all the doors and windows, more for peace of mind than any real belief that they would stop a determined intruder. But the simple preparations helped her feel slightly less vulnerable. The phone rang just after midnight, startling Sarah awake from the light doze she had fallen into while reading in the living room chair. She hesitated before answering, knowing that good news rarely arrived at such an hour, but the possibility that it might be Miguel calling to check on the children finally motivated her to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was silence on the other end for several long seconds, then a man's voice speaking accented English with a harder edge than Miguel's gentle pronunciation. There was silence on the other end for several long seconds, then a man's voice speaking accented English with a harder edge than Miguel's gentle pronunciation. "Where is Miguel Martinez?" the voice demanded without preamble. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized this was likely Eduardo, the brother-in-law whose quest for vengeance had driven Miguel into hiding. She gripped the phone tighter and tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," she said, preparing to hang up. "Do not play games with me, senora. I know who you are, and I know Miguel has run away like the coward he is. But he cannot hide forever, and when I find him, he will pay for what he did to my sister." The menace in Eduardo's voice made Sarah's hands shake. but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't call here again. Look outside your window, Senora. See the man standing by your mailbox? He works for me. Tomorrow there will be more men, and the day after that even more. Miguel can run to the ends of the earth, but I will find him eventually, and when I do, I will make sure he suffers the way Carmen suffered." Sarah's eyes flew to the front window, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw the silhouette of a man standing exactly where Eduardo had said, close enough to the house to be clearly visible, but far enough away to avoid any immediate confrontation. "The children," Sarah whispered before she could stop herself. Eduardo's laugh was cold and bitter. "The children are innocent. My quarrel is with their father, not with them. But they deserve to know the truth about what kind of man raised them, don't they?" The phone went dead, leaving Sarah standing alone in the dark kitchen with the terrible knowledge that Miguel's past had finally caught up with them. Eduardo had found the ranch, knew about Miguel's disappearance, and was clearly prepared to use whatever tactics were necessary to force Miguel out of hiding. As Sarah checked and double-checked all the locks before attempting to return to her restless sleep, she realized that the quiet interlude following Miguel's departure had been nothing more than the calm before a very dangerous storm. The morning after Eduardo's threatening phone call, Sarah woke to find 3 more men positioned around the ranch property, like sentries guarding a prison. One sat in a truck at the end of the driveway, another had positioned himself on the hill overlooking the house, and the third was visible near the cattle gate that led to the main road. They made no attempt to hide their presence, clearly intending their surveillance to serve as psychological pressure rather than covert observation. Sarah's first instinct was to call the sheriff, but Miguel's warnings about avoiding law enforcement echoed in her mind. If Eduardo had indeed tracked them down through legal channels or government records, involving local authorities might only make their situation worse. Instead, she called Tom and asked him to come to the house immediately, using a code phrase they had established for emergencies. Tom arrived within 20 minutes, his rifle clearly visible in the gun rack of his pickup truck, and his expression grim as he surveyed the men positioned around the property. He parked close to the front door and walked quickly into the house, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that made Sarah's stomach clench with fresh anxiety. "This isn't about cattle rustling," Tom said bluntly as soon as they were inside with the door locked behind them. "These boys aren't local and they're not here for any livestock. What kind of trouble has Miguel gotten himself into?" Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She could continue lying about Miguel's past and hope that the situation would resolve itself somehow. Or she could trust Tom with the truth and hope that his loyalty to the family would extend to protecting Miguel's children. The sound of Elena's laughter drifting in from the kitchen, where she was helping Roberto build a tower out of blocks, made the decision for her. "Miguel's first wife didn't die in an accident," Sarah said quietly, watching Tom's face carefully for his reaction. "She killed herself, and her family believes Miguel was responsible. Carmen's brother has been hunting Miguel for years, and he's finally found us." Tom's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes that suggested this information wasn't entirely surprising to him. "I always wondered why a man with Miguel's education and resources ended up on a remote ranch in California instead of staying closer to family in Mexico," he said thoughtfully. "How much danger are we talking about here?" Eduardo made it clear that he wants Miguel to suffer the way he believes Carmen suffered. "I don't think he'll hurt the children, but he's definitely willing to use them as leverage to draw Miguel out of hiding." Tom nodded slowly, his mind clearly working through the tactical implications of their situation. "How many men do you think he has?" "I saw at least 4 yesterday and 3 more this morning. But Eduardo said there would be more coming, so we could be looking at a dozen or more eventually." The sound of trucks approaching the house made both of them freeze. Tom moved to the window and carefully peered through the curtains, his body language becoming even more tense as he observed whatever was happening outside. "Looks like our visitors are getting ready to make a more direct approach," Tom said grimly. "There's a black SUV pulling up to the front gate, and the men who are watching from a distance are moving closer to the house." Sarah's heart began racing as she realized that the psychological pressure phase of Eduardo's campaign was apparently over. She quickly gathered Elena and Roberto from the kitchen, trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring as she explained that they needed to play a special hiding game for a little while. "Are we hiding from the bad men like in the stories?" Elena asked with the unsettling perceptiveness that seemed to characterize everything about Miguel's daughter. Something like that, Sarah said, leading both children to the large pantry off the kitchen that she had identified as the most secure hiding spot in the house. You need to stay very quiet and take care of Roberto until I come back for you. Elena nodded solemnly and took her little brother's hand, pulling him into the pantry with the same protective instinct that had made her such a good big sister since their father's departure. Sarah closed the door and arranged some kitchen chairs in front of it, hoping the crude barricade would provide at least a few extra minutes if someone managed to get into the house. The sound of car doors slamming and heavy footsteps on the front porch announced that Eduardo's patience had finally run out. Tom positioned himself near the front window with his rifle, while Sarah moved to the telephone, her finger hovering over the buttons as she tried to decide whether calling for help would make their situation better or worse. A heavy knock on the front door echoed through the house, followed by a voice that Sarah recognized from the previous night's phone call. Mrs. Martinez, my name is Eduardo Valdez. I believe you and I spoke last night about my brother-in-law, Miguel. I would like to have a more detailed conversation with you about his whereabouts. Sarah and Tom exchanged glances, both understanding that this was the moment when their peaceful standoff would either escalate into violence or potentially be resolved through negotiation. Tom nodded toward the door, indicating that Sarah should respond while he maintained his position with the rifle ready. Miguel isn't here, Sarah called through the closed door, her voice stronger than she felt. I told you last night that he's away on business. Eduardo's laugh was the same cold sound she remembered from the phone call. Senora, please do not insult my intelligence. I've been watching this ranch for days, and I know that Miguel left in great haste several weeks ago. I also know that he has not returned and has made no contact with his business associates or his children. The fact that Eduardo knew so much about their situation made Sarah realize that his surveillance had been going on much longer than she had initially suspected. He had clearly been gathering information about their daily routines, business operations, and personal relationships for weeks or even months before making his presence known. What do you want? Sarah asked, deciding that direct communication might be more productive than continued deception. I want justice for my sister Carmen, who died because of Miguel's selfishness and neglect. I want him to face the consequences of his actions instead of hiding behind a new wife and a new life like nothing ever happened. The passion in Eduardo's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah found herself feeling an unexpected sympathy for his pain, even as she feared what he might do to satisfy his need for revenge. The loss of a beloved sister, especially under suspicious circumstances, would be devastating for any family member. Miguel is gone, Sarah said truthfully. Even if I wanted to help you find him, I don't know where he went. There was silence for several long moments, then the sound of whispered consultation between Eduardo and his men. When Eduardo spoke again, his tone had shifted from demanding to calculating. Perhaps you are telling the truth, Senora, but Miguel is a man who loves his children very much, and a man who would not abandon them permanently without ensuring their safety. I believe that if his family were in danger, he would find a way to return and protect them. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt cold fear wash over her as she realized that Eduardo was planning to use Elena and Roberto as bait to draw Miguel out of hiding. The children's innocent presence in the house had transformed from Sarah's greatest responsibility into her greatest vulnerability. The children are innocent, Sarah said, echoing Eduardo's own words from the previous night. They don't deserve to be caught in the middle of something that happened before they were even old enough to understand. I agree completely, Eduardo replied, his voice now carrying a false reasonableness that was somehow more frightening than his earlier anger, which is why I am prepared to make you an offer, Mrs. Martinez. You and the children can leave this ranch today, with enough money to start a new life wherever you choose. All I want is for you to leave a message for Miguel, telling him that his brother-in-law is waiting here for him to return and face the truth about what he did to Carmen. Sarah looked at Tom, who was shaking his head emphatically while mouthing the word no. They both understood that accepting Eduardo's offer would essentially be signing Miguel's death warrant, but refusing it might put Elena and Roberto in immediate physical danger. The decision was taken out of her hands when the sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder as they approached the ranch. Someone had apparently called the sheriff despite Sarah's reluctance to involve law enforcement. and she could only hope that the arrival of official authority would diffuse the situation, rather than making it more dangerous for everyone involved. Eduardo's reaction to the approaching sirens was swift and decisive. Sarah heard rapid Spanish conversation between him and his men, followed by the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting. By the time the first sheriff's vehicle pulled into the driveway, the black SUV and its occupants had disappeared, leaving behind only tire tracks and the knowledge that this confrontation was far from over. Sheriff Jim Morrison had known Miguel Martinez for 5 years, ever since the quiet Mexican rancher had purchased the property and begun building one of the most successful cattle operations in the county. Morrison was a practical man who believed in live and let live philosophy, but the report he'd received from Rosa, the housekeeper, about armed men surrounding the ranch had demanded immediate investigation. Sarah watched through the window as Morrison stepped out of his patrol car, his hand resting casually on his service weapon, while his experienced eyes surveyed the property for signs of trouble. He was a tall man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades dealing with the complicated problems that arose when people tried to settle their differences outside the law. "Mrs. Martinez," Morrison said as Sarah opened the front door, Tom flanking her with his rifle now discreetly positioned out of sight. "Rosa called my office about some uninvited visitors causing problems out here. Mind if I come in and talk about what's been going on?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, knowing that once she involved law enforcement officially, there would be no going back to the relative simplicity of handling the situation privately. But Eduardo's threat to use the children as bait had made it clear that she was facing forces beyond her ability to manage alone. "Of course, Sheriff," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "I'll get the children, and then we can talk." Elena and Roberto emerged from their hiding place in the pantry with the resilient adaptability that had helped them survive their young lives filled with uncertainty and loss. Elena immediately went to Sheriff Morrison, whom she had met several times during his visits to discuss ranch business with Miguel, while Roberto hung back shyly but seemed reassured by the presence of a familiar authority figure. "Well now, Elena," Morrison said gently, crouching down to the little girl's level, "Rosa told me there were some strangers bothering your family. Are you and Roberto doing okay?" Elena nodded solemnly, her dark eyes reflecting a wisdom that no 6-year-old should possess. "The bad men want to hurt Papa, but he's not here anymore. Mama Sarah is taking care of us now." Morrison's eyes flicked to Sarah at Elena's casual reference to her as Mama, and she could see him filing away information about the family dynamics that had apparently shifted significantly since Miguel's departure. The sheriff had clearly noticed Miguel's absence and was trying to piece together the timeline of events. "Elena, why don't you and Roberto go play in your room for a little while so the adults can talk?" Sarah suggested, and the children obediently headed down the hallway, Elena's protective hand on Roberto's shoulder as they walked away. Once they were alone, Morrison settled into Miguel's favorite chair and pulled out a small notebook, his manner becoming more official as he prepared to document whatever Sarah was about to tell him. "Start from the beginning," Morrison said simply. "Rosa mentioned armed men, but she was pretty worked up and speaking mostly Spanish. What exactly has been happening out here?" Sarah took a deep breath and made the decision to trust Morrison with a carefully edited version of the truth. She explained that Miguel had received threats from his deceased wife's family in Mexico, that he had left the ranch for everyone's safety, and that Carmen's brother had tracked them down and was demanding information about Miguel's whereabouts. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but mostly studying Sarah's face with the practiced eye of someone trained to distinguish between truth and deception. When she finished her account, he was quiet for a long moment before asking the question she had been dreading. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Is Miguel wanted by law enforcement in Mexico? Are we dealing with someone who's fled from criminal charges?" The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard, but she realized that half-truths would only make the situation more complicated. Morrison deserved to know what he was dealing with if he was going to help protect Elena and Roberto. "Miguel was investigated but never formally charged," Sarah said carefully. "Carmen's family believes he was responsible for her death, but the authorities concluded there wasn't enough evidence for prosecution." Morrison nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that this information fit with suspicions he had already been harboring. "And now the brother has decided to pursue his own version of justice?" "That's what it looks like." Eduardo made it clear that he's not interested in legal processes anymore. Tom cleared his throat from his position near the window. "Sheriff, these men aren't just making threats. They had us surrounded this morning, and their leader was talking about using the children to draw Miguel back here. This has gone way past harassment into kidnapping territory." Morrison's expression hardened at the mention of threats against the children. Whatever his opinion of Miguel's past actions, Elena and Roberto were innocent American citizens entitled to protection under his jurisdiction. "How many men are we talking about?" Morrison asked. "At least 6 or 7 that we've seen," Sarah replied. Eduardo said there would be more coming. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, studying the landscape with the tactical awareness of someone trying to evaluate defensive positions and potential approach routes. The ranch's remote location, which had always been one of its attractions, now represented a significant vulnerability if armed men decided to lay siege to the property. "Here's what we're going to do," Morrison said, turning back to face Sarah and Tom. "I'm going to station a deputy here at the ranch full-time until this situation is resolved. I'm also going to reach out to federal authorities, since we're dealing with threats that apparently cross international borders." The mention of federal involvement made Sarah's stomach clench with anxiety. She had hoped to keep the situation contained locally, but Eduardo's aggressive tactics had apparently escalated things beyond the scope of small-town law enforcement. "What about Miguel?" Sarah asked quietly. "If Eduardo is right that Miguel will come back to protect the children, won't that just put everyone in more danger?" Morrison's smile was grim but reassuring. "Let me worry about Miguel, Sarah. If he's smart, he'll stay far away from here until we can neutralize this threat. And if he's not smart, well, we'll deal with that problem when it arises." As if summoned by their conversation about him, the telephone rang with the sharp urgency that had characterized all of the calls Sarah had received since Miguel's departure. She looked at Morrison, who nodded encouragingly, indicating that she should answer while he listened to the conversation. "Hello?" Sarah said cautiously. "Sarah, thank God you're all right." Miguel's voice was strained with exhaustion and worry, and she could hear traffic noise in the background suggesting he was calling from a payphone somewhere far from the ranch. "Miguel, where are you?" Sarah asked, acutely aware that Morrison was listening to every word of the conversation. "Somewhere safe, but not far enough away if Eduardo has found the ranch. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. Take Elena and Roberto and go to Father Martinez at the church. Stay there until I can figure out how to end this safely." "It's too late for that," Sarah said quietly. "Eduardo was here this morning with armed men. The sheriff is here now, and he's calling in federal help." The silence on Miguel's end of the line stretched so long that Sarah began to wonder if the connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resignation that broke her heart. "I never should have brought you into this, Sarah. You were supposed to be safe, supposed to have a quiet life taking care of my children if something happened to me. Instead, I've put you directly in the path of danger." "The children need their father," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Elena asks about you every day, and Roberto still has nightmares. Whatever mistakes you made in the past running away isn't protecting them anymore." Morrison stepped closer to the phone and indicated that he wanted to speak. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. "Miguel, Sheriff Morrison is here. He wants to talk to you." Morrison took the phone with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling volatile situations. "Mr. Martinez, this is Sheriff Morrison. I think it's time you and I had a conversation about how we're going to resolve this situation without anyone getting hurt." Sarah couldn't hear Miguel's response, but she watched Morrison's face as he listened, noting the slight softening around his eyes that suggested Miguel was saying something that resonated with the older man's sense of justice and protection. "I understand your position, Miguel," Morrison said finally. "But hiding isn't solving anything, and your children need stability. I'm prepared to offer you protection if you're willing to come in and work with us to end this threat legally." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Morrison outlining a plan that would bring Miguel back under controlled circumstances, while simultaneously setting a trap for Eduardo and his men. It was risky and complicated, but it offered the possibility of resolving the situation without further violence, or the ongoing trauma of separation for Elena and Roberto. When Morrison finally hung up the phone, his expression was thoughtful but determined. "Miguel's coming back," he announced. "Tomorrow night, under circumstances that should give us the advantage we need to arrest Eduardo and his associates." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror at the news. Miguel's return meant that Elena and Roberto would be reunited with their father, but it also meant that the final confrontation between Miguel and Eduardo was about to unfold on the ranch where she had hoped to build a peaceful life. As she looked out the window at the mountains that surrounded their valley, Sarah realized that her grandmother's warnings about men who kept secrets from God had led her to this moment of truth. Tomorrow night would reveal whether Miguel's past could finally be laid to rest, or whether the sins of yesterday would destroy the fragile family that had formed in the wake of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds that connected parents to children across time and tragedy.